Hey, this is Dominic, and this is your home for the cutting-edge conversations on optimizing your personal performance, lighting up your sex life, and living a purpose-driven life of your own design.
These are the topics that Dominic and I have both struggled with in our own lives and still don't always get right. This is Brian. Welcome to the Great Man Podcast.
Many men, myself included, learn to stop feeling our emotions at a very early age because emotions aren't manly, right? So what happens? Well, we subsequently build an overdependence on our minds that carry us through decades or even an entire lifetime of thinking, analyzing, strategizing, calculating. And our minds can get loud, can't they? Like so loud sometimes that you can't even hear anything else, like your instinct, intuition, or even your heart. Especially your heart. I can't tell you how many men I see and I work with who are just completely disconnected from their heart. And your mind can start to feel like a bunch of wild horses pulling you in a million different directions, leaving you bruised, battered, and exhausted. But perhaps worst of all, feeling controlled by your mind versus you being in command of it. Can you relate to that on any level? I know I certainly can for many years of my life. Now, Napoleon Hill, who's one of my heroes, wrote volumes on the necessity of training your mind and learning how to direct your thoughts so you can create a life you're thrilled to live. Thoughts become things, right? But training your mind takes practice. It doesn't happen on its own. A great man makes that commitment to training his mind so he can consciously, intentionally build a life that he loves and stave off drift in the process. So today, we're diving into a mindfulness discussion specifically focused and geared towards men with one of my most trusted meditation advisors and friends, Mark Melvin. So who is Mark Melvin? Well, Mark is a corporate attorney by trade. He's been practicing law for about a decade and a half now, but he's a yoga, meditation, and breathwork instructor at heart. He's also a master's student right now in clinical mental health studies because he wants to become a counselor as well. And Mark found yoga and meditation after he grew tired of binge drinking and isolating as solutions to his inner world problems. And he noticed that he was constantly uncomfortable in intimate relationships and knew there had to be a better way. Mark is one of the anchors in the Great Man Mastermind, and he is our resident expert when it comes to all things mindfulness. And Mark is a man that's been in my life for over 2 decades now because we met at the University of Richmond, where we were, I would say, acquaintances and loose friends who ran in different circles. But we reconnected over the past 3 or 4 years when we saw each other posting on social media about these inner work journeys that we were having. And Mark has really emerged as one of the most inspiring, heart-opened, and powerful men that I have the pleasure of being around. He's one of the guys that the men in the mastermind really look up to. And before Mark came along, many of the men in this mastermind had never practiced breath work or meditation or gotten frustrated by it and are now big time believers and have daily practices of this thanks to Mark's instructions. So you're in for a treat today. So in our episode today, Mark breaks down the common resistance points that many men have to meditating. And he also throws some stones at why working out is not your meditation. It's one of the common things that Mark and I hear all the time. Working out's my meditation. No, it's not. And we're going to tell you why not. Well, Mark talks about why and how we become indentured servants to our minds. Those are my words, not his, but how we often become kind of controlled by our minds versus us commanding them. Mark says quite beautifully, one of the most important assets you can have in life today is the ability to focus your mental energy. And at the end of this episode, he's going to give you a mindfulness practice that can be used in business, as well as 2 breathwork practices for focus and de-stressing. And then also we talk about how meditation is essential in helping you break free from the old identity of who you think you are, who you thought you were, so that you can create a new future of your own design and living the great man within you. So enjoy today's special episode of Mindfulness for Men featuring Mark Melvin. Bri, buddy, it's been probably like 8 or 9 months since we've had a real substantive conversation about mindfulness and meditation on this podcast. And we've got one of our favorite people here today to lead us in that. Before we introduce him, how excited are you about it?
I'm very excited because Mark Melvin is the guy that I think of when I need to find more empathy in my life. When I'm starting to feel really judgmental or critical, I'm like, man, what would Mark do in this situation? And that's one of the superpowers of having like a really close friend and colleague, seeing how he leads us through some of these mindfulness techniques. So I'm very excited about this conversation today.
Yeah, it's a special kind of person who can occupy that shelf space in your mind where it's kind of like when a fork in the road, what would Mark Melvin do? And you've got that when it comes to empathy and mindfulness. Mark, man, welcome to the show. Like long time coming. We're thrilled to have you here, buddy.
Yeah, thank you for having me here. It's really a privilege. I'm incredibly excited.
So cool, man, because, Mark and I went to the University of Richmond together, Richmond Spiders.
Go Spiders.
Go Spiders. We were friendly, right? I mean, we were on student government together. We had respect for one another. We were in different fraternities. So we didn't intersect a lot on the social front of things, but there was always that mutual respect for one another. And then, we graduate school, 15 years go by. We probably don't hear from one another. And then over the last few years on Facebook, right, as I started speaking out about some of my transformation and doing inner work, you started posting, a lot of inner work stuff as well. And then we kind of recognized each other and we're like, hey, sounds like, we're both kind of on a similar journey right now. And it's led us to doing some deep work together. And now you're an anchor in the mastermind. You lead a lot of meditation, breath work, and yogic practices for the men of the group, which has been profound. So I think maybe the first place to start here, man, before we dive into, mindfulness and men, is just even a little bit of a background on your journey of awakening to some of these deeper yogic mindfulness breathwork practices.
Yeah, absolutely. And incidentally, I remember the specific post, the specific thing that I posted that sort of prompted you to reach out to me. And it was the story of this guy who had a house across the street. And I will answer your question, I promise.
Yeah.
The story of this guy who had a house across the street from where I was living in Charlotte. And he had this water backup problem in his basement. And rather than clean up the mess, what he did over the course of years and years and years is just throw newspaper on it. So when he actually had to leave that house, the crew had to go in with jackhammers and actually jackhammer that plastered newspaper off his floor. There was about 16 inches of newspaper soaking up that mess and that waste. Really for me, what I equated that to is what we as men do emotionally in our lives. We don't clean up the messes. We just throw newspaper on them. We let the debris build. And when it's finally time to go to work on some of this stuff, we have to take a jackhammer to it. And it doesn't have to be like that. And, for me, I unfortunately was one of those who had to take a jackhammer to my issues.
Ditto.
Yeah. Yeah. It's another bozo on the bus in that regard. My journey here, I think like a lot of people started very young, and it started with some difficult childhood experiences. I won't get into the nitty gritty details, but I grew up in a home with a lot of alcohol abuse. There was definitely substance abuse as well. So for me growing up, I would say, for anyone out there who's an adult child of an alcoholic, there's certain archetypes. And in my house, I occupied the role of the hero. In some ways I had like this parentage thrust upon me. I had an older brother who was sort of doing his thing, a baby sister who occupied a lot of my dad's time. And my dad, I should say, was really my primary support scaffolding as I was growing up. But even with that, his focus had to be on my sister. So in a lot of ways, I was kind of left to my own devices, sort of a very trust-based relationship. And unfortunately, I had to grow up much quicker, maybe than I would have otherwise wanted. I think the positive side of that is that it instilled in me a really deep sense of responsibility for other people and for the well-being of other people. The other side of that, and I would say the less desirable and what became the ugly side of that, for me was really an inability, to regulate emotion. And, underneath that, what was really even more detrimental was a lack of emotional fluency. So for me, my MO was always mistaking emotion as thought. So I regularly thought about emotion, thought about what I was going through, thought about what I was thinking. So, I was very heavily identified with my analytical mind. Much of my sort of consciousness and who I believed myself to be was wrapped up in thinking, was wrapped up in my brain. Fast forward to college and was introduced to Reiki and energy healing by a couple good friends there. I would say at that point in my life, I was certainly starting to indulge in some of these undesirable patterns. Certainly my lack of emotional fluency came out.
Hey, Mark, how does that happen? So it sounds like you laid the newspapers down. You've got this like emotional, but thinking emotional. I've been looking for like, what is the jackhammer in your story? And I just heard you say in college, friends introduced you to Reiki.
Just to show how different your college experience was from mine, my friends introduced me to Mad Dog and beer funneling. So,
right. Reiki wasn't something that came up on Friday or Thursday after class, right? Like that was not.
Reiki was Thursday mornings. Beer funneling was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday.
Okay.
Got it.
So there's plenty of that too.
Always a healthy balance.
One of my close friends, a lifelong close friend, a guy named Justin Meunier, who's a doctor in New Orleans now. He got me involved in Reiki with a guy named John Moon. And I would say at that time, for me, if I identify a point in my life when I was really woken up to who I am and to my potential, as a being on this planet, I would say it was certainly then. The issue that I had is I wasn't ready for that level of, not only that level of work, working in an energy field, working with Reiki, emotionally and psychologically, I wasn't prepared really for the information and for the teaching that he gave me.
Yeah, it's a big step to go from like being so heavily left brain associated thinking mind to go straight to that energy realm, bypassing even the emotional fluency part. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's totally accurate, because at that time of my life, I was obviously still very immature, and more often than not, I was vacillating somewhere between severe anxiety and selfishness. Those really in a lot of ways are opposite sides of the same coin. So there's this worthiness, there's this, unlovability from my childhood. There's also this need to control, this, real big sense of probably overinflated sense of responsibility as a result of that sort of parentage role I took on at a very young age. So yeah, I think you're spot on. And, for me, what it really came down to, I had that background, and I think having that in my pocket and having that to return to is sort of a homecoming for me, really paid dividends in my 30s. So if we fast forward for another big chunk of time, I went to law school, of course, started in private practice, went into big law, was with a pretty large firm for about 5 years, and it was that at that point in time and really before that, I started to repeat a lot of the patterns that I grew up with at home. Binge drinking, really isolating myself a lot from the world. I didn't particularly feel comfortable in relationships. I didn't particularly feel comfortable with friendships. I think part of that is because, I'd never really done the work of kind of clearing away some of these old stories, clearing away some of the childhood experiences, to really get a sense of who I was as a person, what drove me, what gave me my greatest energy, and really the places where I wanted to devote my time and find purpose. And it was about 5 years ago, as a result of, a few different instances, not least of which was the fact that I met an absolutely amazing woman, Kara, who I'm still with today. We've been together for 7 years. And she recognized, because of similar childhood experiences, the patterns that I was repeating. And so for us, the rubber really hit the road, and I got to make a choice. I got to make a choice between drinking and our relationship. And for better or worse, for better, let me say that. But I, at that point, chose to quit drinking, but I didn't quit drinking for myself. I quit drinking to rescue a relationship. So at that point in time, really what happened for me is, okay, so I had this time, especially on the weekends, Friday nights, Saturday afternoons. And look, I live in Hilton Head Island. Hilton Head Island is unequivocally and statistically one of the drunkest places in America. Period. It is. Certainly in the state of South Carolina. So what I really started doing, I sort of adopted this mentality of live childlike. Not childishly, but live childlike. Think about all the things that I wanted to do as a kid that maybe for whatever reason it wasn't cool, my friends weren't doing it, that I wanted to do. Just start doing those things. So for me, the transition really started with playing. Started playing with Legos. I started coloring in adult coloring books. really trying to activate sort of the right side. I don't buy into this strict left brain, right brain, dichotomy that people have come up with over the years. And I think science has largely broken some of that down. But at the same time, opening up those creative capacities that are associated with right brain dominance. And what I found from that, from getting creative, from playing, from, just sort of letting myself roam a little bit, that the thinking side of my life started to calm down a little bit. And at that time, I also hired a coach, hired a meditation teacher. At that point in time, I actually was trained in transcendental meditation.
Mark, I do have a question about this moment where you have this choice to make, which is either I stop drinking and I stay in this relationship, or I continue down this path, and you chose the path of relationship. Like in that moment, a big part of your life became a void. And it sounds like you started to fill that in with creative activities. And I know for myself, whether it's been like not going out as much or not drinking, sometimes it's hard to think like, well, what else do I want to do? The part that I want to ask you about is this idea, what made you go to, I'm going to do childlike stuff. I'm going to bring out the Legos, because that seems like an interesting choice.
Yeah, that's a great question. To me, it was pretty intuitive because I, in a lot of ways didn't have a childhood experience, at least one that I recollect with any sort of clarity. So, I think on some level, I had this intuitive need to just sort of re-child and re-wild myself, to sort of break loose of some of the conditions I'd put around my life of being an adult. So it was kind of spontaneous, intuitive, Brian. I will say the sort of epiphany that led to it for me was, spending a lot of years convincing myself, and I love my mom dearly. We're very close. But at the same time, convincing myself I'm never going to turn out like my mom. And then waking up one day, looking in the mirror and being like, holy shit, like there she is staring back at me. That was too much to take. At that point, I can either take a gamble, see how it goes, see if I can manage this thing, or I can just quit and know I won't go down that road. So that's how that decision was made. And then the being childlike thing, as I said, was pretty intuitive. Now, there were a couple things that were on my bucket list. When I quit drinking, when I started meditating and really recommitted, I would say, if Reiki woke me up, now I'm growing up. So when I committed to that, one of the things that was always on my list was climbing a mountain. It's like, I want to climb a mountain. Here I am 36 years old. I've never climbed a mountain. And I thought, what, I'm just going to start training to climb a mountain. So it was that goal, that bucket list thing of climbing a mountain that got me back into health and fitness. I've got these creative things, this childlike thing going on. I've got this dream of climbing a mountain. So all of a sudden the fitness wave is starting to roll in. And then I'm meditating. So the spiritual wave is really starting to sort of crest as well. And all of these things really kind of came together, just the exploration, getting back in touch with my body and getting my body healthy, and then working on my mind through meditation. I would say really kind of came to a head. It was about 18 months. And I'll never forget the day. I was walking down the street. I was walking my dog. And it occurred to me that the only thing that had been in my awareness for probably 20 minutes was grass, blades of grass. That's it. And I was like, God, silence, like the quiet, it feels so good.
I think it's so important to hit on that, Mark, especially because the themes you're talking about here, I think so many men can relate to around the voice being so suffocatingly loud in your mind, the thinking mind that we get praised for, applauded for. A lot of the guys who listen to the show are high-performing guys. You're in a legal profession. I was in financial services. Brian was in consulting. The only thing we're working out all day long and get rewarded for all day long is like that thinking mind. And yet we can become indentured servants to that mind because there is none of that creativity. There is no room for spirituality. There is no room for silence to just actually appreciate blades of grass or nature or the scent of a woman, like whatever those things are. And I think that's why it's so important that we're talking about what we're talking about today, which is, mindfulness specifically for men, maybe to just take us up to present day, right? Like, these things then led you to studying yogic practices, meditation and breathwork practices, maybe even just kind of bringing us up today to what are those things that you have studied and that you teach, And then I'd love to dive into how can we start to wake up the men who are feeling like they were you a few years ago, like where you were a few years ago in the journey where your mind was just the only thing that you could hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the process of instituting a lot of these therapeutic lifestyle changes in my life, I returned to studio yoga, asana practice, technically what it's called, but really started to love the way my body felt. And I picked up a book called Where Are You Going? It's a yogic philosophy book. And I didn't really understand at the time how deep and how rich and how ancient the world of yoga was. I had never really been introduced to the positive psychology of yoga. And what I found in yoga was a system that didn't require dogma or doctrine, but a system that really encouraged exploration, understanding my own capacities, working with my own capacities, and finding a way of developing that fits my life. I chose to go through yoga teacher training. When we were in our training, we of course learn a vinyasa style. So if you go to a studio yoga class and you're doing sun A's and sun B's and upward dog and downward dog, things like that. But as part of that training, we read this book called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's about a 2,500-year-old text, and it was really the first time that the philosophy and experience and practice of yoga was put in a complete compendium. So, really what I found in that book were answers to everything, that I needed for my life at that time. So with the yoga background, with the yoga certification, my own meditation practice, I started to really study very deeply yogic scripture, ancient yoga, the Yoga Sutras. I was studying Upanishads, and then got connected with a school in India called the Bihar School of Yoga and started studying integrated yoga. And, that really, for me, sort of understanding that the yogic approach to things like mindfulness and meditation involves preparation, preparing the body, preparing the mind to meditate. It became a very sort of natural transition into coaching and teaching along the lines of yogic lifestyle. So I do teach in studios. I do teach vinyasa yoga. I lead vinyasa yoga. But when it comes to teaching, I really love teaching yogic lifestyle. And I love teaching yogic witnessing practices, things that develop non-reactive awareness. So, for me today, I'm working one-on-one with quite a few people on the yogic lifestyle piece. Of course, with the workshops, retreats.
What does that look like, Mark? Like, what does coaching somebody in a yogic lifestyle look like?
So with Ashtanga yoga, with the Ashtanga yoga system, you have 8 limbs. And really the beginning place for someone who wants not only to strive towards meditation and mindfulness, but wants to strive towards yoga and a yogic lifestyle, you start with the yamas and niyamas. These are yogic disciplines, essentially, restraints and observances. And what these practices are meant to do, and these are things like nonviolence, non-stealing, purity, self-study, things like that. Really what these things are designed to do, and these practices are designed to do, is to right-size your ego with the rest of the world. So to a certain extent, there's a process of right-sizing the ego, helping people understand how they not only identify themselves, but how they identify others. And I think, on that note, one of the biggest barriers to mindfulness for anyone, and especially, for men, because I tend to think, men maybe do more in this area, is the ways we misidentify ourselves. I am a this. I'm a fan of this team. I'm a member of this political party. I'm a success. I drive this kind of car, So it's really working with people to understand how they identify themselves and helping them understand how creating those identities create distance from themselves in the rest of life. And that isn't to say that we don't, do our business anymore. We aren't fathers or brothers or sons anymore. We aren't proud of the things that we accomplish. It simply means that, identifying as a certain thing doesn't energize our lives like it once did. So we're more open, we're more spacious mentally, if that makes sense.
This does make sense. It makes a lot of sense because for the first time, Mark, I understand you more. I thought that you were a guy that just likes to go on really cold hikes up mountains, which I thought was quite frankly insane. But now I get it because the mountains and the meditation were your jackhammer. Like that is what allowed you to get where you're at. And what I witness in you now, when I see you on this podcast, when I see you talking with the men in our group, is you're bubbling over. This mountain climbing thing and this meditation thing has been so powerful in my life, I can't help but want to teach it. And so now I understand where that drive comes from, and it's a really beautiful thing to witness and to receive.
Yeah. And what I'll jump in on here is, Mark, you talked a lot about this identity piece that I think is super important to dive in on here, because every man who's listening to the show wants something different for himself than what he has today. And oftentimes we can't get those things that we want because that would require imagining ourselves in a new way. And as a result of that, our identities are so firmly entrenched in the past. I'll give some tangible examples. I always wanted to be an entrepreneur, live a life of my own design. But when I was working in corporate, I always said that I don't have the discipline to start my own business or to see it through. That was my identity, which was old and antiquated, but it was only when I finally, through meditation and mindfulness, was able to slow down and see that old story that I could then create a new existence for myself. So I'm curious for you, when you are either an example from your own history, or as you're witnessing other men that you're coaching, what are some of these limitations that we place around identity, and how do mindfulness or yogic practices help us to dissolve that and create something of our own choosing?
It's a great question. And we'll kind of necessarily talk a little bit about psychology and neurology. But I think, when it comes to the ways we self-identify, those are heavily charged with emotion, and to me, a lot of the emotional charge, a lot of that identity really kind of resides in the lower regions of the brain, and are triggered more in lower regions of the brain. So, if, for example, someone self-identifies as a member of a particular political party and that party's ideas are attacked, then that is interpreted as an attack on the individual, because they have sort of rooted that identity somewhere in their mind. So in a very real way, when we create these identities and we identify certain things outside of ourselves, we're really setting ourselves up for our own suffering. We have this fight or flight response. Typically, that's used to save you from a tiger stalking you in the jungle. Today, we use it to protect ourselves from attacks on our psychological identities. So the more you psychologically identify as certain things, I'm this, I'm that, the more susceptible you are to psychological attack, number one. And number two, the more susceptible you are to constant states of fight or flight, constant activation of your sympathetic nervous system, blood pressure, pulse rate. So not only do these identities have a psychological and emotional impact, they have a very real physical impact on the body. So what the process of mindfulness and meditation does, and I'll really get into this in two ways. Number one, on the mindfulness side, I personally use mindfulness and mindfulness practices. And in yoga, we refer to that as pratyahara, inward turning. I use witnessing exercises. So things like sensory scanning, I'll do a lot of sound scanning, body scanning. And what that does is it helps you develop non-reactive awareness. You're essentially firing up your chief executive officer in your brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. When you have these witnessing experiences or you engage in these witnessing practices, and by constantly activating that front location of the brain, that internal CEO, you're essentially training the brain to use its executive functioning to override what's happening emotionally down in, let's say, the amygdala. So over time, what happens, one, you become less triggered by these apparent psychological attacks. The identity, I guess the attachment to the identity starts to break down because you can actually process what's being said by another person or, an organization. So you don't get so triggered by it. That's an obvious benefit right there. But also, I think over time, and it's, Brian and Dom, it's really hard to capture in words, but, as you work with mindfulness, as you work with meditation, the thinking brain starts to calm down. And when you stop thinking, you start perceiving, you start intuiting. So people get concerned about losing their thinking mind because it's like, I'm going to lose my edge. If I'm not thinking, if I'm not constantly thinking, I'm not going to have it. I can tell you that more often than not, when we're thinking, all we're doing is efforting. That's it. Trying to get somewhere through sheer effort. Sometimes it works, but through that process of meditation, through mindfulness, you start to intuit, you start to perceive. And you guys, I'm sure, have had this experience. You hear a lot of guys say, well, I get my best ideas when I'm in the shower. I get my best ideas when I'm running. I get my best ideas, when I first wake up in the morning. The one thing that you're probably not doing when you're showering, running, or first waking up in the morning is doing a lot of thinking. I mean, you're close to your subconscious, you're perceiving life. And I feel that when people start to perceive life more clearly without those thinking filters, because look, I mean, what are our thoughts? Our thoughts are mostly memories, right? Memories are fallible. Our thoughts are oftentimes about future projections, fantasies. Also, they're not just infallible. I mean, they're not just fallible. They're flat out wrong, these future fantasies. So you stop time traveling. You stop fantasizing about the future, ruminating on the past. You have perception in the here and now. And when that happens, it's almost like a cracking open, the heart. It's like you can't help but to feel greater connection to people in the world around you when you're not constantly thinking.
Yeah. The analogy that's helpful for me is like, as humans, we have like a 6-cylinder engine. And one of those cylinders is the thinking mind. There's all these other cylinders, like you just talked about, the perception and feeling and intuiting. And when you've just been running off of one cylinder your whole life, you don't even recognize the absence of the other 5 until you actually sit down and give it an opportunity, like those other engines, to fire. So that's something that's been helpful for me from a mindset perspective. All right, Mark, man. So let's talk brass tacks here, right? Like you've done a great setup here about like why mindfulness practices, witnessing practices, why meditation practices, why yogic practices have all been essential to your life, right? In transforming to living a life where you're dominated by your mind to a life of your own design. All that said, why aren't more men stepping forward towards mindfulness practices, meditation and yoga practice? Like, what are some of the barriers that you're seeing standing in the way of men jumping forward into this?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, there's this belief that if you start meditating, you're going to somehow go soft. You're going to lose your edge, right? And I think hopefully it's clear by now that, for an individual who is meditating and who can turn off the thinking mind, or at least detach from the thinking mind and get into a state of pure perception is a superpower. There's nothing sharper.
What do you mean by pure perception? For someone who's never experienced pure perception, what does that mean?
Flow state, complete present moment awareness. So I imagine a lot of the men on here have actually experienced a flow state. So that's the closest kindred spirit to that idea of pure perception, pure awareness in the present moment.
I've heard this question asked before as like, what is your happy place? Like think about a time in your past. If you could go back there right now, what was that like? What were you doing? What was that state?
You're asking me what my happy place is?
I know your happy place at top of a mountain with an iceberg or something.
Right here with you guys.
My happy place, if I were to describe it, is why our podcast is explicit. So let's just move past that. Yeah. Mark, continue.
Continue, yes, sir. The other thing I hear from guys, it's less of a why and it's more of an excuse. And if I had $1 for every time I heard a guy say, well, I work out, that's my meditation, would never have to work again. I mean, I would be able to teach yoga for free the rest of my life. And I think it's really important on that note to first say that, can physical activity be meditation? Sure. But I think to get to that point, like if you're a marathoner, an ultra distance runner, a climber, you probably have already done a lot of the work before. But, very briefly, when you exercise, your sympathetic nervous system is activated. When you meditate, it's the opposite. You're activating your parasympathetic nervous system. When you exercise, brain waves are increasing. You're going to higher, more active brain waves. When you're meditating, it's slowing down. Now, some of the benefits can feel the same because when you exercise, your hippocampus is generating new neurons. You're generating new stuff in the brain. So the focus is there. The calm, the relaxation is there through exercise. It's not the same because with meditation, again, you're triggering your brain's prefrontal cortex, the CEO, and training it to light up when you experience a stimulus in your life. So the two are very different. And I think that's very important for men to understand. Your exercise is your exercise. It's different than meditation.
I love that distinction. And I would also add that as guys, we're often in do mode. Right? Like doing. Working out is another form of doing. And then meditation is in the being. And that is something that needs to be practiced. If you are in do mode 98% of the day, going into being mode is painful at first. I remember sitting down to do 1 to 2 minutes of meditation felt like a punishment that I was inflicting upon myself because every ounce of my body wanted to scratch my nose or go do something, knock off a to-do list item. And working out is another one of those things. So I offer that up to any man who can really feel that, who's saying that, working out is my meditation. We would respectfully decline that.
I think there's sort of this misconception that meditation is something that's woo-woo, that you need like a guru and crystals and things are supposed to happen when you're in practice.
You don't need crystals?
You can use them if you like them. Certainly not necessary.
I legitimately dated a woman who had crystals in her bra. It didn't last long. But it was wild and weird.
Wow.
I'm glad I don't have to do that.
I do meditate with incense, but that's because the room where I meditate is also the room where my cat's shit boxes are located. It's the only place I can get free in the house.
There's that. Incense I've ever heard.
I've ever heard, yeah.
Yeah, so there's that. But no, you definitely don't need anything. And I think, look, I'm a corporate attorney. I'm a master's student. I'm working on my clinical mental health counseling master's degree. I teach, I run workshops. I have a lot of stuff going on in my life. So focus is paramount for me. If anything, you're not losing an edge. Through meditation, you're sharpening your saw. You are honing in focus by training your brain CEO. There's a phrase, the focus economy. We've talked about that a little bit, that one of the most important assets anyone in business can have today is the ability to focus on a single item and to dedicate their attention to one thing, because most people simply cannot do that for an extended period of time. And when I'm talking about extended, I'm talking about 10 minutes.
Yeah. Mark, we're running the 6-week program for men to power up their purpose and productivity. And we did a whole conversation around the 4 dimensions of energy: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So many of the men who left that night were focused on their focus of mental energy, because either your mental energy is scattered like a buckshot or it's focused like a laser beam. And there's so many things that are competing for our attention just in your cell phone alone, right? I just wanted to make sure I double down and emphasize what you just said, that one of the key competitive advantages that you as a man can develop is your ability to consciously focus your attention and to do deep thinking, because so few people can do that these days.
Yeah, and that's really, Dom, how I try to contextualize this work for men, because this term meditation has become very ubiquitous, right? People say, well, I'm going to meditate. Meditation, at least in yogic thinking, is a state. It's a particular state of consciousness when your body and your mind are at a certain place of relaxation and focus. The practice that we actually engage in to get there is essentially a focus practice or an awareness practice. So you may be focusing your attention on a single point, a word, a mantra, the breath, whatever the case may be. So really in that sense, the majority of the time you are in practice, at least initially, you're practicing focus.
When I think about meditation, I think about me going to sit down, cross my legs, and boom, get into meditation. But something I heard you say earlier is that there's some pre-work. There's some conditions in which we can put ourselves in first prior to, boom, going into meditation. Can you talk about that?
In terms of preparation and in yogic thinking, we have to sort of establish a certain state of calm in our body and in our mind before we can really, again, thinking of meditation as a state of consciousness. To achieve that, we have to have a certain level of calm. Because if there are disturbances in the body, if there are disturbances in the mind, if there are emotional disturbances, it's going to be very difficult to maintain focus on whatever it is you're focusing on for your practice. Again, the breath, the mantra, whatever the case may be. So when I work with people, typically what I do first and foremost is on some level, get them moving their body a little bit more, get them stretching a little bit, not necessarily yoga, but just working with the spine, working side to side, twisting a little bit, doing some forward folds, just to take some of the dis-ease out of the body. So a little bit of that, a little bit of deep breathing, something to just relax the nervous system, engage the parasympathetic, deactivate the sympathetic, get the heart rate down, and get the mind a little bit calmer. So once these things happen, and again, Brian, this is a process. These are things that are done over a period of time, honing the body, honing the mind, honing the emotions. so that when you sit, you can actually sit undisturbed for a period of 20 minutes. It doesn't seem like any time at all, but it took me years, literal years, to be able to sit calmly for 20 minutes and be okay with whatever happened, because there's this thing in my body. There's, this story in my head. And frankly, some of that work, Brian, I had to do through counseling. I had to do through therapy, being able to work out some of the emotional issues that I had, so that I could actually be in a place of being undisturbed for meditation.
On the point of therapy, one of the things that you did that was such a service to our mastermind was in our group chat when you decided to sign up for therapy for another round of it, right? Because you've done therapy over the past 4 or 5 years. You're like, hey, fellas, I just decided to go back into counseling for these reasons. What ended up happening was there were about like a 10 or 11 other men in the group, myself included, who were like, congratulations, man. I've had therapy. I've done counseling before. And I think for the men who in the group who hadn't experienced therapy, or even some of the guys who had, were surprised at how many other men had done it, because we oftentimes think it's a sign of like, there's still stigma around going to counseling and therapy. And one of the things I know we wanted to, Mark's laughing at that. I and you and Brian all believe that going to therapy and counseling is a sign of strength. The fact that like you have recognized and have the self-awareness that there's something that you want to work on, that you've had the courage to take the step to make the investment of time and finances to do it. And then to like share it with other men, like that is, I think, ultimate level of courage. And I just wanted to hit that. But back to you, and we're talking about preparing the body so that the mind can relax. Is there like a breathing technique? Because one of the things that you were talking about is slowing the breath so that you can then prepare the mind to settle. Is there a breathing technique that you could recommend to our men here that they could practice as a precursor to sitting in meditation?
Yeah, I think, for me, I like using a traditional deep 1, 2, 3 breath. That's going to involve, of course, sitting with the spine upright. You definitely don't have to be cross-legged, Brian. You can be in a chair. You can even be at your office. But sitting with the back upright, the head aligned up over top of the shoulders, closing the eyes, and then start by simply breathing into the belly. Place your right hand on your belly and breathe into the belly. And simply notice the rising and falling of the belly as you breathe. When you start to really experience the rising and falling of the belly, place your left hand on your chest over your heart. And after you breathe into the belly, you notice your right hand expand. Keep breathing in through the nose, out through the nose. Notice your chest expand. Keep deep breathing, a few breaths, and eventually over time, you're going to notice your collarbone lifting. So this is called 1, 2, 3 breathing. You have an expansion in the belly, a lift in the chest, a lift in the collarbone, all done in and out through the nose. But an even simpler technique, Dominic, and you've just read the book Breath, and I know you'll appreciate this. If there's only one thing men do with their breath, it's stop breathing through your mouth. Close your mouth and only breathe through your nose. And I guarantee you, if you sort of really orient your breathing focus around breathing in through the nose and out through the nose throughout the day, the natural byproduct of that is that you are going to, perhaps hourly, perhaps more frequently than that, you're going to check in with your breath. You're going to become aware of your breath. So that automatically, simply by committing to breathing in through the nose and out through the nose, it's going to bring awareness to your breath throughout the day. And that starts the process of unlocking that prefrontal cortex, the brain CEO.
And that 1, 2, 3 breath, making sure that I have that right. The 1 is the belly expands. The 2 is the chest expands. And the 3 is the collarbone rises. And the reason why that's so important is it would be a chest expand first. My 1 would be my chest would expand and then my shoulders would come up and I would have very little breath coming from my belly. And I'd be willing to bet it. Many men who are listening to this also don't have breath coming from the belly, because when we're breathing from our chests and the collarbone rises, that's when our sympathetic nervous, if we start there, that means that we're in that like activated fight or flight mode. This is where anxiety comes from. And I know that I have, anxiety has been kind of a thing that I've dealt with for most of my life. When I started practicing breathing into my belly, and when I take an inhale and my belly presses out, I had to work on that, Mark. That is something that I think a lot of men who are listening to this, who haven't practiced breath, will have to consciously focus on. And I can assure you guys, even if it feels like your belly is not moving at all, like a rubber band is almost holding it in place. Keep practicing it. Within like a week or so, you'll start to feel much more expansion.
Yeah. And one thing you can do with that, 11 is a really nice breath count number. If you want to take that deep breathing and actually create a practice around it, you can start breath counting. It's called Zazen, basically. So simply take 11 breaths. Take a deep breath into the belly, chest, collarbone. At the top of the breath, count 1. Out through the nose when everything's empty, 1. And do that for 11 breaths. And that could be really a complete starter practice that could quite frankly lead to meditation. My own meditation practice is a breath-based practice. It's simply following my breath.
I know, Mark, you've mentioned earlier this idea when we get out of our thinking brain, we can be more present in the moment. And I've noticed in moments of stress, whether that's like a relationship conflict or a professional conflict, I can feel that reaction. And when I feel that, when I catch it, if I'm able to do what you said, breathe through the nose, breathe out, I've noticed that I'm usually about 6 breaths away from a different emotion or being more in the moment. And so I've noticed that some of my conversations are a slower pace and longer, but with better outcomes. So what you're talking about is simple as this breathing through the nose, breathing out through the nose sounds. It's one, difficult to do because we got to catch it consciously first. And 2, it's really powerful, really, really powerful.
It is. And it's very powerful physiologically too, because the nose is the organ intended to breathe. It cools and filters the air that's going into your body. It promotes a longer breath, which improves heart rate variability. And guys, if I know Dom and Brian have talked about that probably on the show, you can look it up, but the greater your heart rate variability, that's a key indicator of lower stress. If you have very low heart rate variability, chances are you've got some stress in your life.
Yeah. And these practices of meditation have helped me to skyrocket my heart rate variability, which allows me to recover more quickly, deal with daily stresses. Hey, Mark, maybe there's one more meditation practice. You've given us some breathwork techniques, but a meditation practice that you could leave our men with, and then we'll hit if anyone is interested in furthering their work with you, whether it's bringing you into a workshop for their companies or doing one-on-one work, how they can reach you. Let's hit those last 2 things.
I will say this. It's less of a meditation practice. It's more of a mindfulness practice. And for the men listening, I think this will be a mindfulness practice that will go a long way for you at home and in business. And it's mindful listening. So, is a mindfulness practice. And it's very important to understand that mindful listening activates the same areas of the brain as mindful breathing. That's empirically studied. So when a person is speaking to you, your spouse, a colleague, be with that person. Be completely involved in what that person is saying. You may not like it, but if you're attending to that person and you're listening mindfully, your judgment's going to be cut off. Your internal CEO is going to be activated, and it's going to make you less stressed. So for men, I would say practice mindful listening, attending to a person that's speaking with you, especially your spouses, your girlfriends, your partners, mindful listening.
I've never thought about listening as a practice to improve other areas of my life. That's wild. Breathing makes sense. Meditation makes sense. But listening as a practice? Okay.
Yeah. Listening mindfully improves mental function.
And Mark, would you say that mindful listening is an awesome opportunity to bring in the breathing that we're talking about? Because there's oftentimes when you're listening, your mind's in a million different places. I've found that sometimes putting a hand on my belly or just even focusing on slowing my breath while I'm listening to that person helps me to take in more of what they're saying.
That's a good one. Also, you can sort of focus on the space where your lips connect. Oftentimes, we have this urge when we're trying to listen to open our mouths and say something. So, focusing on keeping the mouth shut is an anchor point. Mindfully keeping the mouth closed.
Mindfully shutting your freaking mouth. Okay.
Yeah, mindfully not talking while another person's trying to speak.
Mindfully, I'd love for you to keep your mouth shut. Okay, there we go. Great.
Mark, man, this has been great, dude. Like I said, this has been a long time coming. And if there's someone who's listening who's like, hey, I would love to bring in Mark to do a mindfulness workshop for my organization or do a speech, or if I want to work with Mark one-on-one, what's the best way of doing that? And do you have capacity?
I do have capacity. I would say you can get me a couple ways. One, on Facebook. I know a lot of the men listening are part of the online community. You can certainly get me through Facebook.
Oh yeah, that's the Great Man Within Podcast community. So if you come to the Great Man Within Podcast, Mark's in there. You can reach him directly through there.
Yeah, Instagram, I'm Mark A. Melvin. That's MarkaMelV as in Victor, IN. And then personal email, markamelvin@yahoo.com. I am 41, so I still have a Yahoo account.
Yeah, well, it's not an AOL account, so I think you're
Hotmail.
You can
I had Hotmail until a few years ago.
Yeah, it's kind of like AOL's the worst, Hotmail's next, Yahoo's is like there's someone's coming for Yahoo, and then eventually we're all going to come over to Gmail. Mark, man, thank you so much for the service that you do, not only inside the mastermind, but through this podcast now and reaching other men out in the rest of the world who needed to hear this. We'll have you back soon, dude.
Yeah, man, you're such an access point to this kind of work, man. I really appreciate it. Doing yoga with you when you led our mastermind in it, along with my partner's 73-year-old father who had never done yoga before.
That's right.
He said, this is the first time I've been able to feel my body in this way. So you're such a great access point, man. Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you, guys. It's really been a pleasure being here. I appreciate it.
All right, you know what time it is? It is take action time. At the end of every one of these episodes, we talk about not just listening to this episode and making it an intellectual exercise, but finding one thing that you are going to implement from the conversation with Mark today, whether it's that mindful listening practice that Mark talked about, the 1, 2, 3 breathing, or anything else that really resonated with you. What is that one thing you are going to put into action right now? And if you want to share it, we'd love to hear it. So head over to the Facebook group, The Great Man Within Podcast, and let us know what you're up to.